A population of Jewish people has existed in Ethiopia for over 2,000 years. They call themselves Beta Israel, House of Israel. Their Ethiopian and Arab neighbors call them Falasha, meaning exile or stranger. To us in the West, their way of life seems primitive. Through their lengthy existence, one of the central goals and sacred ambitions of all Beta Israel was to one day return to Jerusalem. The destination of the Beta Israel is clear, but their origin is shrouded in mystery. How did these unique people end up in Africa? There are several theories.
One of the chief legends of the Ethiopians, not just the Jews, but the Ethiopians in general, is that their queen, who was the Queen of Sheba, visited King Solomon. Now that's in the Bible. That great visit is a famous Bible story. According to the Ethiopian version, the queen came home pregnant by King Solomon, and when she had a son, Menelik, she sent him to Solomon to be taught how to be a great ruler. Solomon kept him in his palace, taught him, and when Menelik, the son, went back to Ethiopia, he was accompanied, according to the Ethiopians, by 1,000 Jews from each of the 12 tribes to bring Judaism to Ethiopia and help him rule. And so King Solomon's a very important figure in Ethiopian religious, cultural, and historic life.
When Solomon died around 3,000 years ago, the Israelites split into two kingdoms. 10 of the 12 tribes formed a kingdom of northern Israel, leaving the tribes of Benjamin and Judah in the south. The northern kingdom was wiped out by the Assyrians who came from Mesopotamia in 722 BCE. The few survivors of the 10 lost tribes scattered. One theory is that the remnant of the lost tribe of Dan fled south through Egypt to Ethiopia. There they became the Beta Israel. The Beta Israel mostly settled in small villages in the mountainous northwestern part of Ethiopia known as Gondar. Families lived in mud huts called tukul, and each village built a larger mud hut which served as the village synagogue. The Beta Israel had no electricity or running water. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and craftsmen. For thousands of years, the Beta Israel were cut off from other Jews and the rest of the outside world. This was a result of their geographical isolation and the often hostile neighboring states. During these years of isolation, intermarriage, and frequent oppression, the Beta Israel were passionately observant Jews. Since their isolation began long before the Talmud was ever written, they practiced a literal form of biblical Judaism, unaffected by rabbinic interpretations. Their religious leaders are called Kessim, but act more like the Kohens, priests of the Bible rather than teachers. They read from a Torah or Orit written in the liturgical language of Gez. After thousands of years of a primitive, isolated existence during which they believed they were the only Jews on earth, the Beta Israel were finally rediscovered by the modern world.
In the late 1860s, a famous French linguist named Joseph Halevi had been to Ethiopia and became an advocate for that community. And his most famous student was a man named Jacques Feitlovich, who was an ethnologist. And in 1904, Feitlovich went to Ethiopia and lived among the Falasha community for 18 months. And he came back to Europe and organized pro-Falasha committees in Italy, in Germany, and the United States, and dedicated the rest of his life to the rescue of that community. Feitlovich came up with three critical ideas. First was he believed that the rescue of the Falasha depended upon their receiving modern education and their reintroduction to and connection with world Jewry. And the third critical idea that Feitlovich introduced was the notion that ultimately Ethiopian Jewry could only be rescued by Aliyah to Israel.
Though, once that was over, Sudan was no longer a possible rescue exit for the Jews.
But what about the Jews in Ethiopia?
There were thousands and thousands of Jews left behind by Operation Moses. The need for a massive rescue was tremendous. During this period, in the 80s, a civil war that had been going on for a long time, and that was led by people from the province of Tigray in the north and by the people from Eritrea who wanted to secede from Ethiopia, never having felt they were part of Ethiopia. That was getting more and more powerful and dangerous. And the area where the Jews lived, largely up in Gondar province in the northwest, was becoming a battleground.
In the late 1980s, the communist Ethiopian government under Mengistu was losing the war with the rebels. They asked foreign powers for aid.
The Ethiopians had appealed to Israel for some aid and got some humanitarian aid and perhaps a little more than that from the Israelis, with the requirement that if we give you this aid, you have to let the Jews leave.
The Ethiopian government issued a statement saying that Jews with relatives in Israel would be permitted to leave. They had to make their way to the capital city of Addis Ababa.
There's one all-weather road from Gondar province in the northwest to Addis Ababa, the capital. Finally, when the road opened because the fighting moved elsewhere, the Jews began to come down that road on every form of transportation that was available, buses, trucks, donkeys, by foot. They came down, and 22,000 of them arrived in Addis Ababa. Was an exodus of exhausted, sick, emaciated, dehydrated people without a penny to their name, nowhere to go.
The Jews in Addis Ababa were dying in large numbers. Finally, the Israelis made a deal with Mengistu. Planes could fly into Addis Ababa to remove Jews. Logistics were complicated, however, by the rebel troops closing in on the city. Suddenly, over 20,000 people had to be processed and documented by Israeli and American volunteers prior to boarding the planes. This was done at the Israeli embassy. The grounds were crowded with hungry, frightened, and excited Jews.
Nobody knew how long this truce we had was going to last. We had the government army on one side of the city and the rebel army on the other side of the city, and at any moment somebody could start firing a shot and this whole airlift would be over. So the object was to pack as many people as possible onto every plane. And if you have a bundle, that can take up the room that a baby or a small child could be fitted into. So we had to take everything away from them. And I remember saying to them, to the women, if you have another dress, put it on over the one you're wearing. And so you had women pulling a second dress over their heads and a second shama, their shawls around their shoulders. We had miracles in this day that I'm describing to you. I mean real miracles. Not a single person who came sick died. Everybody made it. When the planes started leaving, there were babies born on them. The Israelis had had a doctor on every one of these planes, and every woman who gave birth on the plane survived, every baby survived. Incredibly, no plane crashed. Addis Ababa's airport had one runway suitable for international jet traffic, and we had 40-odd flights coming in and leaving. And when they came in, they landed, they didn't turn off their motors, they opened their doors, and the people were loaded onto them, packed into them, and they took off immediately, and after they discharged their loads in Israel, they turned around and came back again. So you had planes landing, you had planes leaving on this tiny airport constantly for 36 hours. Amazing, amazing. Every flight managed.
The miracle of Operation Solomon took place for 36 straight hours on May 24th and 25th of 1991. 14,324 Ethiopian Jews were airlifted from Addis Ababa to a new home in Israel. The moment the planes landed, the entire country was in a state of rejoicing. Israel, there is no doubt that Operations Moses and Solomon saved an entire community of Jews from extinction.
The Jews came out of Egypt. We are told that the Red Sea parted and the waters stood like two walls while the Jews passed between them. In Operation Solomon, on May 24th and 25th of 1991, two great armies that had been fighting each other for years stood like two walls on either side of the airport in Addis Ababa while the Jews passed between them. And what was the route that the Jews took to the Holy Land, the Promised Land, the land of Israel? The planes that the Israelis had sent flew north over Gondar province, where the Jews came from, and then turned and flew out over the Red Sea and turned north again over international waters until they could come into Israeli airspace. And so we're told in the Seder that we must think of the Exodus as if each one of us came out of Egypt, and in Operation Solomon, the Jews of our time came out of Ethiopia and crossed the Red Sea on wings of eagles and came home.
شبالنا قرلجي يمتامر صوناتن صاملجين يملجي تقابو يلونال يتسكلون من يورد لنال نانو نانو نيه نانو نانو نيه كانتالين قداي نانو نانو نيه نانو نانو نيه كانتالين قداي خوي يلاي بشوفך يخسור שוב האור בעיניי לא גמור לא עוזב המגע בידייך שיבוא ויעיר למשמע כל צחוקך ננו ננו נהיה ננו ננו נהיה קנצלי גודאי ננו ננו נהיה ננו ננו נהיה קנצלי גודאי ממעמקים קראתי אלייך בואי אליי מול ירח מאיר דרכך שוב אליי נפרסו ונמסו מול מגע של ידייך באוזנייך לוחש שואל מי זה קורא לך הלילה הקשיבי מי שר בקול אלייך אל חלומך מי שם נפשו שתהי מאושרת מי ישים יד ויבנה את ביתך מי ייתן חייו ישימה מתחתייך מי כעפר לרגלייך יחיה מי אוהבך עוד מכל אוהבייך